I was an agnostic with suspicions. I was sitting in the highly polished second pew of a tiny suburban Pennsylvania church where my wife and I had recently been married. The service was ending, and I was wrestling with deep theological questions, like where we were going to eat that afternoon and whether or not the Eagles' offensive line could handle the Giants' defensive pressure. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around, and a woman we'd recently become acquainted with said, "John, I've been thinking about you and praying about you, and I think you would make an amazing youth leader." And I smiled and thought to myself, I know you. You're the current youth leader. She had done her time. She had paid her debt to society. She was getting out, and she needed a victim, a volunteer, a minister of the Lord. And fortunately, I fit the two main criteria for a small church youth worker. I was young, and I was there. And she said, "What would you think about coming to our youth meeting tonight and seeing what it's all about?" And I thought, well, what could that alter about the complete trajectory of my life? But it turned out to be one of those pivot point moments. Over the weeks and months that followed, I realized that I loved working with teenagers, that I had an affinity for adolescence, that I wanted to spend time with the people most reasonable adults avoided. I was like a demented storm chaser. That looks horrible, let's go there. But something rather miraculous happened. As I began to teach these young people about a faith that I did not have, my faith began to grow. And the ministry grew as well. An opportunity came with that growth, and I eventually found myself leaving my career as an art director to enter into full-time ministry. And that was 25 years ago. Now, the last decade of that journey has been spent ministering to a sprawling, disparate virtual congregation made up of people all over the planet. In my travels, both in person and online, I do a lot of speaking, but I also try to do a lot of listening too. I can hear or read hundreds of stories each week, and at this point, I don't consider myself an author or a blogger or even a pastor, but a collector of stories, a war correspondent. I step into a new community, or I reach a new town, or I meet people where they are online, and I get into the trenches of life with them, and I say, "Tell me what's happening here on the ground so that I can tell the folks back home." And this gives me a front row seat to their varied experience of being human. People give me proximity to their pain. They show me their grief. They share with me their struggles. They reveal to me their dreams. And I sit in that time with them, and I hear their words, and I listen for the places their voices break. And I leave my time with them asking, what are they trying to say that they cannot quite verbalize? What do they wish more people could hear if their voices could carry? How can I connect their humanity with the humanity that does not share geographic and relational space with them? And that's the place I now minister and write and speak from. I do my best to be a translator of diverse stories and to find the commonalities in those very different narratives. But now for the first 10 years after that tap on the shoulder, I loved being a local church pastor. So much so that if we had met back then, I would not be the rather mundane, middle-aged mortal you see before you. I was someone much greater. I was super Christian mega pastor man. I was preaching to thousands of people each week. I was overseeing a massive youth ministry with hundreds of students, a shamefully large budget, and I was doing creative, life-giving, meaningful work in a community that I loved and was loved by. So outwardly, it was a dream scenario, and for a while it was. But if I was super Christian mega pastor man, I began experiencing two forms of kryptonite. The first was that I started to have theological questions about the nature of prayer, about the infallibility of Scripture, about our theology toward the LGBTQ community, about the existence of hell, about the lack of female pastors in our church, about the lack of diversity in our church. You probably recognize some of that internal agitation. You can probably understand the conflict that comes when life begins to argue with your theology. You may have many of those questions right now. And it's one thing to experience that existential shaking as a civilian Christian, as someone sitting in the chairs. But it's another to go through that profound shaking as someone expected to believe and teach a set of rules and doctrine, and to stand up before people with unwavering certainty and to say, this is who God is, and this is what God says, and this is how you are to live your life based on what that God says. But the further I walked down the road of ministry, and the more I studied the teachings of Jesus, there was a growing tension within me between the person I was becoming and the pastor that I was expected to be. And standing up in front of those people in those chairs, I began to feel the weight of the collective expectations of the congregation. And I knew that in the environment where I was, doubt was a moral flaw and certainty was sacred. And so I began to slowly play the part of someone who was more sure than he was, because that's what I thought the people in those chairs wanted. What I didn't realize until later was that the people in those chairs were looking up at me thinking, look at how confident he is. Look at how sure of himself he is. I'll never be that certain. I have these doubts and these questions, and my doubts and questions, they're not going to be safe here. So they and I, together with incomplete information, began participating in a conspiracy of pretending that often afflicts churches. We became highly edited, partially sanitized versions of ourselves. Just honest enough to ingratiate ourselves into the collective, but not so honest that we expose the flaws and failures that could push us to the periphery or get us expelled altogether. We became curators of inauthentic spiritual community. Now, if these questions and this pretending wasn't enough, as super Christian mega pastor man, my second existential threat came in the form of looking around at my life, now 10 years into ministry, and I realized that the church had actually shrunken my table. I began to suspect that I was a better person before I was a pastor. Because back then, I had diversity all around me. Back then, I could talk about religion, I could talk about politics. But now, not only was I hiding the deepest contents of my heart, but I was now only around Christians. And only around Christians from my church. And only around Christians from my church who believed what I believed. And only around Christians from my church who believed what I believed, who I liked, which was just my wife, essentially. And I did my best to get better stories. I decided I needed to spend time with people whose experience of God and church and America and law enforcement were different than my own. And so I began collecting those stories. And as I spent time with people, they began to tell me about the ways that the church had damaged them, that individual Christians had hurt them. And they said to me, John, this thing you're a part of, this white Christian church that you are associated with, it doesn't just seem like it wants to push me away. It seems actively out to harm me. So there was this ever-widening chasm between organized religion and my now very disorganized spirituality. There was a gap between who I was becoming and the pastor I was supposed to be, between what I dreamed the church could be and what it was looking like. And I did my best for about 6 or 7 years to hold those things in tension But then I looked around, it was around 2015, and I realized that there was this growing theocratic movement, and I needed to make a decision as a leader. I could take those theological questions and I can put them on the shelf and not talk about them. I could continue to play the part of someone who was sure, or I could take those questions down and ask them out loud and see if other people didn't have those questions too. And I could take those stories of people who were being damaged by the church and I could put them to the side and I could refuse to hear what those stories were telling me. Or I could centralize those stories and begin asking why the church is still so toxic to so many. So I decided with the questions and with the stories to lean in. I decided to preach the questions and write the tensions and speak with specificity about what was happening in America and in the church. Around this time, I had started at a new church community, and after only 5 or 6 months, I heard God calling me to leave that church. And it came in the form of my pastor's voice saying, "You're fired." What I started to find out very quickly about that particular church, but many churches, is that the people there, they loved boldness in their ministers until that boldness confronted something or brought discomfort. Suddenly, my newfound authenticity and specificity were not welcome. Now, even though I knew it was coming, even though I had seen the signs, and even though I knew I was probably going to preach myself out of a job, still, it was devastating. Because after now 17 years, this was not just my livelihood, this was my life's work. These were people I loved. This was part of my identity as a caregiver. And I can remember that first Sunday morning, waking up tearfully saying, for the first time in 17 years, I don't have a church to go to. For the first time in 17 years, I don't have a group of people to pastor. For the first time in 17 years, I don't have a local church community. And then suddenly a voice in my head that sounded like my own, but joyful, said, "John, for the first time in 17 years, you are free from the expectations of a group of people. You are not at the mercy of your role as pastor, your identity as minister. You are not beholden to one spiritual community, and you are not responsible to represent anyone else's faith convictions but your own." And it was at that moment that I realized, after I was released, that I had been given a gift. I could now ask anything and I could say everything. I was emancipated from the illusions of certainty and from the pressures of ambiguity. I could finally, after 17 years, finally become the human being I was being led to become and the pastor that I was becoming. I wish that I had done better as a pastor of helping people normalize their questions. I wish that I could have admitted my vacillation in real time so that they could have admitted theirs. I wish we as a church could have given people permission to diverge, that we could have made space for doubt, for uncertainty, for even active unbelief, because whoever and whatever God is not intimidated or threatened by those things. Only insecure people are. But true, beautiful spiritual community should be the place where we can bring the fullest contents of our hearts, where we can actively confront the injustice and the inequity in the world, where we can name precisely the sickness that we see, even when that sickness is collective and even when that sickness is in the church. And I regret that I didn't sooner jettison that dangerous ambiguity that was afraid to speak into issues directly. I wish I hadn't succumbed to the pressures to be liked or loved as a minister. Because what I came to find out was that organized religion and organized crime can be very similar. When you're on the inside, when you're part of the family, you are fiercely loved and passionately protected. But the moment you deviate, The moment you have your allegiances questioned, it can be concrete shoes and horse heads in the bed, right? I regret my lack of authenticity and specificity personally because I think it postponed me becoming the human being that I should have been. I grieve it for the churches where I ministered because I think it prevented us from more fully, collectively expressing the compassionate, activist heart of Jesus. But perhaps more than anything, I know that I'm not alone in this, and so I grieve what all of this means for the church and for the world the church exists around. One of the reasons we are experiencing a renaissance of hatred right now, that we have a white nationalism infecting the church, where we see followers of Jesus who are burdened with racism and misogyny and homophobia and anti-Semitism and transphobia. One of the reasons for this is because people of faith, morality, and conscience have been silenced by decorum and shamed into softening their language or pressured to avoid conflict altogether in the name of not being too controversial or too political. The exodus from the church or the avoidance of it altogether is due in large part because decent human beings, people of empathy and intelligence, are looking at the church and they're seeing the damage that conditional community in the name of God can do, and they are rightly walking away. See, because this isn't my story. This is not one pastor's exit interview. This is about the exit interviews of the millions of people that I have met in the trenches since leaving. See, there is a pattern to what people share with me, whether it's a transgender teenager or a migrant father or a Muslim activist or a racial justice worker. They rarely say to me, John, as a white, cisgender, heterosexual male pastor, could you be less bold? Could you be less loud? Could you be less confrontational? What they usually say is, John, why are so many people of faith so silent right now? When I look around, why is the only expression of Jesus that I see something predatory and exclusionary, something that does not even remotely resemble Jesus? I'm grateful 25 years ago that I got that tap on the shoulder, but I regret the fact that I was not a clear and courageous minister sooner. I wish that I could have helped people normalize the questions more, that I could have created space for people to be specific, that we could have taken on the injustices in the world more directly. And I can't go back and be the pastor I wish I'd been. And since I can't do that, I can only get up every day fully repenting of the slow pace of my waking up and committing to stepping into the trenches every day with a hurting, wounded multitude and saying, tell me what's happening here on the ground, and then asking anything and saying everything. I want to be a clear and courageous minister. May we be a clear and courageous people. May we be a clear and courageous church. Thank you.